Welcome to the Global Marketing Show, the podcast for all things international business. I'm your host, Wendy Pease, president of Rapport International and a translation expert. Come along with me today as we talk to an expert in the global marketing world about facing their biggest fears, hearing about mistakes they made or saw, discussing best practices, and sharing fun travel, language, and culture stories. Welcome back to another episode of the Global Marketing Show. I'm very excited today about the guest that we have to interview because he's actually a friend. He's somebody that I've known for years. But before we get to that in our introduction, I want to remind you that the podcast, the Global Marketing Show, is sponsored by Rapport International, the company that offers high quality written translation and spoken interpretation services around the world. Recently, I hear that they've been answering a lot of questions about AI and appropriate uses for it. And I can assure you that it is not replacing humans right now for anything that is important in growing your revenues or decreasing your liability. And I have a tidbit from Rapport International. This one is a Swedish word. It's ugelbar. And it's Swedish that the Language Council of Sweden removed from its 2013 top 10 list of new words. The word translates as unfindable on a search engine. Google wanted to brand it and change the definition to ungoogleable, but the council refused and expressed its displeasure with Google's attempt to control the language. So I thought that was fascinating and a good representation of why humans are still involved in the translation process, because not everything can be answered by automation. So let's get on to introducing Steve Becker. He is passionate about improving human health by unlocking power of molecular diagnostics. He's held senior positions at Thermo Fisher, Quest Diagnostics, Agilent, GE Healthcare, and I know him because our sons went to school together. And what I know is that he's in the industry and that he travels a lot. He does something in sales, marketing, business development, and licensing. So I figured he would be a great guest on the Global Marketing Show. So welcome, Steve.
Yeah, thank you, Wendy. Great to talk to you here and looking forward to our chat.
Yeah, so you and I have had an interesting conversation about medical devices and diagnostics, because I would put diagnostics right in the middle of being a medical device, but you had a different take on that. Share that with me and our listeners.
Yeah, I mean, generally, from a regulatory standpoint, diagnostics is covered by a lot of the medical device rules. But when you think about medical devices, or at least I do, I often think about things you get implanted with and the like, whereas diagnostics is really the ability to measure your body, whether or not you're healthy, whether or not you're sick, and if you are sick, what's making you sick, right? And so being able to help really uncover your current health status and what you can do to improve is really the heart of diagnostics.
See, my position is that diagnostics are a subset of medical devices, but I'm glad you clarified that because that makes a lot of sense.
The interesting things about diagnostics, right, in the healthcare world, it's about 2% of the total spend, but over roughly 80 to 90% of what a doctor needs to be able to make a decision about what to do to treat you. So it's an incredibly important part of the diagnostic care continuum. And whether or not you're enabling it with research tools, or whether or not you're providing, advanced diagnostic technologies to hospitals and clinicians and ultimately patients, it's super important.
Right, as opposed to implant. Then talk a little bit about that.
Well, I've never been in that part of the world. My son is right now working on a biomedical engineering degree, right? And he's designing medical devices. So right now he's working on a device in his program at BU, Boston University, for gallbladder surgery. He's done some device work over the summer for working in dental surgery. Like at some point I'll have to get a new knee, part of the aging process. So I'll probably have some metal parts put in me, or titanium, or whatever the good students of Boston U's medical engineering group comes up with. We're becoming increasingly bionic.
Okay, that's fascinating to me. So you've really stayed in the diagnostic areas, but you also have been a little bit in the biotech or have some insights into that industry?
Yeah, so I think that, when I grew up in the Silicon Valley, San Francisco Bay Area, that was really where the coming of age of high tech with computers and then ultimately various software, internet, and you mentioned AI earlier, right? Silicon Valley is really still sort of a central point of where that kind of technology progresses. But increasingly, we're moving into what I'd call an age of biotechnology, where we can feed, fuel, and heal the world. If you think about things like biofuels, you think about things like how do we make our feedstocks either more efficient with agriculture or safer with animal testing or in human health, right? With diagnostics. Obviously, we just went through the pandemic of COVID and biotechnology was all over that, right? It started with actually one of my customers in China was the first company to do DNA sequencing on the coronavirus. Then I had a customer in China place a mammoth order for reagents associated with making a molecular diagnostics, which ultimately was a COVID test. And then obviously the rest of the world jumped on board and it was crazy building out the scale of COVID testing, which Thermo Fisher played a significant role on and my team did as well. Obviously, then we needed to come out with a therapy for it, right? And mRNA, which is the basis of the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines. Those were all outcomes of what I'll call a biotechnology era. The fact that we could accelerate a vaccine development in a year or two versus what used to take better part of a decade to create a vaccine, super exciting, right? So that's why I say we're really in a world where a lot of our economy is driven by biology going forward.
Okay, so since it's a show about global marketing, and you just brought in China and COVID and testing and DNA sequencing, during COVID, there was the vaccine from Moderna, Pfizer, and then the Chinese one that we heard about. But we were dependent on China for the DNA sequencing to get the tests done. Talk to me about what you've seen in the interrelationship between the global companies or the countries around the world and how they're working together or in competition to develop diagnostics.
Yeah, super interesting. You've got a mix of sort of the scientific world, which is apolitical in many regards, right? So when the world was trying to figure out what was going on, there was a fair amount of free sharing of information. As I mentioned, one of the very first sequences was done by a group in China. The molecular structure was found by some group in Texas, right, where they did atomic force microscopy reviews of the coronavirus to actually show it was a coronavirus. And then you have groups in Italy doing further sequencing. And the work around really uncovering the basis of what was getting us sick was really global in nature. As we move towards the concepts of vaccines, that you started seeing a bit more localization. Russia, for example, put out a vaccine pretty quickly. China did as well, or tried to. And in fact, what's interesting is China actually had licensed in, or several pharma companies had licensed in the right to buy or make locally the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines, but they chose not to. They wanted to do it with a Chinese-made vaccine. Obviously, the US got into the act, right? We supported a lot of the research. We scaled up production quite a bit. From an IP perspective, we were able as a country to encourage licensing into emerging markets like India and Africa and the like, which maybe didn't have the infrastructure to build themselves. So all of this gets global very quickly, very fast, right? And that's just sort of an example of just one disease, one condition. Obviously, we face similar things with ongoing medical conditions such as cancer or various other diseases that need to be taken care of. And by the way, you may not know that during all of this, there were some significant, I won't call them pandemics, but viruses raging through the food stocks, right? Things like swine flu and bird flu and all the basics of some of the testing that was done for humans. A lot of that same technology applied into keeping our food stock safe.
Okay, so the scientists work together, so it's more collaborative across country. Yet when it comes to commercialization, it goes more local and competitive.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's right. There's a couple things there, right? A lot of it is cultural. A lot of it is economic.
Say more about that.
Well, culturally, it was important, for example, for the Chinese government to have a Chinese solution. Same for Russia. The cultural thing was how were different cultures, taking on different types of care treatments, right? In fact, in China, for example, if you ever traveled over there, they were often wearing masks. If you go through a Japanese subway, you'll see people with masks, right? They've been doing this for quite some time. And then we come over to America, and just the concept of wearing a mask for many was something they couldn't get their minds wrapped around, right? So different cultures have different ways of approaching the way we take care of ourselves and, frankly, our communities.
Right. So it's a real cultural thing yeah, we're in the US, we're very individualistic. You can't tell me to wear a mask, but if you're in a collective society where Asia is more that way, I'm going to wear a mask for the good of the community, to not
That's right.
endanger myself or others.
Or others, right? Exactly.
What is it about the culture? And would you say the Chinese government, the Russian government, and the US wanted to have their own? Like, I only saw the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines in the US. I don't remember even seeing the Chinese or Russian.
No, you didn't see those imported here, but we had other ones, right? Johnson & Johnson had a vaccine as well, based on more traditional technologies, not necessarily mRNA. Similarly, those more traditional vaccines were stood up in other parts of the world as well, right? We just happen to have access to technology that was leading edge in the Western world, in Europe with Moderna, or with Pfizer and BioNTech, and then here in the US with Moderna.
So it was the access to technology that allowed the US to develop it, which then ended up being sold around the world.
Correct.
Talk to me about how much the US has the technology and can sell things internationally, and how did the licensing play out? And you worked for a large company that had the resources to go out and look for that. So if you could answer that from a large company, but then also a small company, how you compete.
Well, first off, healthcare is a team sport. To vertically integrate all of the things that somebody would need to, say, for example, bring a diagnostic to market, that's a tough ask. Some people are great at making instrumentation, some people are great at chemistries, some people are great at informatics, and then actually being able to run all of that in a laboratory that's got strong quality capabilities. There's really no one group that does it all. So that's why I say that healthcare really starts off as a team sport. It also becomes, as we mentioned, localized. So the standard of care in one country might be different than the standard of care in another, right? And so we see that play out really with two big factors. One being the regulatory environment in various countries or regions. And then the other is the payer environment, who's going to be accountable to pay. So all these things play out to make healthcare local. I spent a lot of time in India, for example, and they face cancer just like we do in any other parts of the world. But the reality is, with 1.4 billion people and growing, with an economy that has, I'll call it poor for lack of a better term, people without access or means to advanced technologies, right? They'll take more simple solutions to testing than, say, in the US, where we may, in our major medical centers like we have here in Boston or New York, San Francisco, Texas, we may go for more advanced and more comprehensive testing solutions, right? Said another way, India will buy all the genomics testing it can afford. Other markets will maybe overprovide, to advance the field.
So when you've worked in the sales and marketing side, how do you change your marketing to adapt for that internationally?
Yeah, well, first off, what is the right solution, right? And what is the right solution for each market? So we have to localize that. I'm involved with this technology called DNA sequencing, where we would say, if we're looking for a cancer, we may want to sequence a number of genes associated with typing a specific cancer, which would then correlate to what specific drug would be most efficient for treating that cancer. Whereas in India, they just may be able to do 2 or 3 genes, as opposed to a panel of up to 50 or even 500 genes, just because of the access and cost of doing something more comprehensive. Now, in many regards, they're providing quality care, but they're not providing the most comprehensive care. And so we have to tailor the solution. And based on that, the scale of the technology that can be brought into play, the complexity of the technology. If you think about DNA sequencing today, It's really played out at some of the major academic medical centers or the major labs because it requires some skilled processing, lots of compute horsepower and strong technical capabilities on the part of the staff. You go to some other markets, they just don't have those folks trained up and able to not only do the work, but actually interpret and analyze the data and correlate it to what they should do to provide treatment. So even if they could do it, you may still want to provide a more simpler solution that's scalable and accessible.
So that means you're really developing multiple diagnostic technologies for
Correct.
one. Yeah. So tell me how you do the strategy for that.
Very simple tenet is you should get paid for the work you do. So it starts off with what is the analytical validity or clinical validity of the test, right? Is it going to measure what we say it's going to measure? And then is there utility? Are we going to be able to do anything with the information that we got? So that's sort of the first starting point, making an assumption that you've got a good test that's useful. Now you got to go back and say, is it going to be reimbursable, right? And is somebody going to pay you for that work? And that gets pretty political. I'll give you an example of that in breast cancer. Here in the US, if we have suspected breast cancer, you'd be able to likely go get a test for the BRCA gene, and then you can make an informed decision whether or not, just based on the genetic information, if you want to take a prophylactic step like a prophylactic mastectomy or something like that, or just go to more watchful waiting and observation. If you're in a single payer market like Canada, which is more of a government sponsored type program, and I may have my facts wrong, but it used to be that if you were 49, you could likely get the test. If you turned 50, the health economics meant that the test wasn't going to be available to you.
Wow.
Right. And basically the thought was, from a risk and a quality of life and a total cost, they had to make a decision. They snapped the line and they said, okay, that's where we draw it. And you can obviously pay out of pocket, but as you know, in Canada, most people tend to expect their healthcare to be paid for by the government.
Right, right.
So again, you see this cultural difference that's driving a lot of the decision making and access. In India, for example, though, for that same situation, there is no commercial insurance or government insurance for a lot of healthcare, and so people actually pay out of pocket. If they can't do it themselves, they'll reach out to family members and often pool the money together to get the funds to pay for the test.
So when you're developing a diagnostic, is there pretty much a list of countries that you'd always go to because of the culture and the reimbursement, or could it vary by disease state?
It definitely varies by disease state. It varies based on lots of factors. I mean, let's take, for example, diseases associated with, say, environment. So Zika, for example, is much more pronounced in chikungunya and some of these other more diseases associated with weather and hot environments like India, Brazil, et cetera, right? These tropical related diseases, that's the word I was looking for. It's super important in those markets to be able to have access to these kind of testings. Whereas in the US, we don't see those kind of diseases that often, right? We don't get dengue fever. We don't get chikungunya. We had a Zika scare, but it got tamped down pretty quick. We watch for things like West Nile virus. The diseases become more localized in some regards. And so the companies make for those markets. One of the exciting things I got to do when I was at Quest Diagnostics is we created a group of labs and network called the Global Diagnostics Network. And the intent there was to actually bring leading companies from around the world to pool their capabilities, their diagnostic insights, and help share samples that we could use for different labs to set up testing. So for example, when Zika broke, one of our customers in Brazil actually had seen Zika patients first. They had developed a test, but more importantly, they actually had the actual samples that were characterized as true Zika samples. They shipped that to our group in the US at Quest, and then we were able to design our own test. And in fact, Quest brought the first Zika test to market, right? We wouldn't have gotten the ability to do that and validate those assays in our own hands if we hadn't first gotten samples from our colleagues in various parts of the world.
And so they weren't Quest colleagues, they were other companies.
It was a totally different company.
That's a great example of the globe working together. So working across all the different countries, I've got to ask about language. How did you go to market across all these different languages and cultures so you could make sure that the products were adopted?
Yeah, well, so in large part, I've been associated with the provision of technologies. So being able to then work with local partners who would then either localize the product, localize the go-to-market strategy, which again gets in the language. It may be the same assay in the US versus, say, Brazil or Spain or Russia, but a local company would actually take our technology, package it up, take it through their local regulatory environment, get all of the associated approvals to market, to do our own clinical evidence and studies and the like, and then they would market it under their brand. Right. And of course, from a language perspective, Wendy, they would do that under their brand with all their marketing in their own local languages.
Wow. And that was pretty consistent across all the companies that you work for?
Yeah, so in large part, there are obviously global in vitro diagnostic companies, companies like Abbott, Siemens, Roche, Thermo Fisher, right? But they have to treat each of their launches locally. They have to get the approvals in those markets. They have to work with the various regulatory bodies or partners to get the clinical evidence for the submission of the regulatory documentation. So in large part, they have to think globally but act locally.
Right. Which is interesting for a brand then, because if you're working with partners all over the world and trusting them to do the study and the regulatory and the messaging around that, you're going to get a multinational brand as opposed to a global brand, and you lose the efficiencies of that.
To some extent, I think that's true. I would say that it's a mix. There's, without getting too technical, diagnostic tests and provided to populations, they call that research use only. If you were, say, a Quest or a LabCorp here in the US or a Synlabs in Europe, a DASA or Pardini in Brazil, they would run a lot of their tests that they designed themselves and provided their populations, and they have to stand behind their work using our technology or technologies of companies like I've been associated with. However, when the company wants to have like a provider of technology like a Thermo Fisher or an Illumina, who's a DNA sequencing company, wants to have a kit that they can sell to a hospital, and that hospital could just run it locally without having to do their own development and validation work. That has to go through an FDA or equivalent type process in the various regions. And that's a big expense. And so that is the expense to go do that. And frankly, the time it takes to get it done is a measured decision on the part of the marketers in those companies.
Both in the US and
Both
in
anywhere in the
the
world.
country.
Yeah, correct. Right. So a lot of European companies will decide to launch their products in the US second because previously it was easier to launch in Europe first.
Mhm.
That's starting to change as Europe is changing its regulatory stance. Different markets had different hurdles to climb, and hence, changing the access to technologies from around the world.
So if you were a medical device company with a product that you wanted to take international, what would be the first steps that you'd do?
Yeah, great question. First off, it's got to prove that it does what it says on the tin, followed by I would look for the right partners to help us go into market. If we were going to do it ourselves, that's a big expense. And so if we were going to be a company doing it ourselves, we'd have to create a really strong business case. We'd have to have a clear path to commercialization, including reimbursement, have a pretty rock solid regulatory path. So that's why often you see companies move that commercial, regulatory, or technical risk to partners. And so, there's really sort of the two approaches, right? Do it yourself or do it with partners.
Right, right. Working with partners, do they take all the regulatory and liability risk off
Generally,
you?
yeah. No, generally they take the risk and we provide some amount of support. But if it's their name, whatever company's name is on the product, they're the ones who take all the liability, and they're the ones who have to do the filings, and they're the ones on the hook. Going back to our COVID example, many of us got a test given to us that we could do home testing before, right?
Yeah.
There was a handful of companies that made those kits. I remember that one of the ones I had was marketed by Roche, but it was actually the original manufacturer was a Korean company. So
Oh,
they did a bit of a
yeah.
partnership, but for most people, they thought it was a Roche product that was showing up on their door. But if you looked at the small print on the back, you'd say manufactured, and there was a Korean company name in the back.
Okay, so they would both share the liability on that then.
I think Roche had to take the lion's share of that. I don't know what the FDA said about how they had to label it, but that was just an example.
And now I've heard about the regulations becoming more strict in Europe. And it used to be the partner would take the liability of it, if they did the translations and they put their name on it, but now it's going back to the manufacturer. So if the instructions for use are translated wrong, the manufacturer would be liable.
Yeah, I hadn't heard that. That's interesting.
What had you heard about European launches being more difficult?
Well, in the diagnostic world, there was supposed to be a change, creating greater stringency around regulating diagnostic tests. It was supposed to launch though in 2020, and obviously that was a bad year to go try to change the world of diagnostics
Yeah.
as we were all facing COVID. That can got kicked down the road, but in essence, right, that these assays are going to have to be treated more, and the workflows associated going to be treated more like a medical device. They'll have to be filed through something called the regulatory body. That's just a lot of time, energy, and it's all for a good cause, right? To increase safety for the populations. But it's a lot of work that everybody had to go do, and it's still going to be being done for quite some time.
If you've got all these partners around the world and they're holding the liability and then they're taking it to market, then the US company who developed it is getting a licensing fee, but then they're not managing any of the commercialization in
Correct.
other
Well,
countries.
it's going back to the vaccine production, right? BioNTech, for example, was the technology creator of one of the versions of an mRNA vaccine, and Pfizer was their regulatory and their distribution partner, right? So they had all of the commercial aspects, and so people often would say, "Hey, did you get the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine?" Right? So
Yeah,
everyone was thinking Pfizer, but the real technology was developed through this other company called BioNTech, which is a German-based company.
right. So you don't really know where it's coming from.
Well, you do,
I
and
mean, it's labeled, yeah.
that, and also a lot of the folks had contract manufacturing. Different companies provided support for the clinical trials. There's a lot of partners all along the way to bring any product in the healthcare space to market. To the point of this podcast and this group, if things get lost in translation, they go awry quickly, right? And so having strong translation capabilities is super important.
What's some good examples that you've seen in the industry?
Oh, well, I don't have one particular. That's a good question, but I mean, you just know when you deal with people and you play that child's game, the telephone game. You whisper in one person there, they whisper in another, and then it gets changed. It's funny until it's not, and so
Yeah.
you don't want to take risks in the healthcare world.
We've heard of all kinds of things. We were asked to prove something and somebody had used the disease AIDS instead of mobility aids. It was supposed to be just all lowercase aids. Heard about people not understanding what a suppository is, so they're taking the medication orally. So we come in sometimes a little late on those and we're trying to clean it up and save the company.
Yeah,
At Rapport International with doing the translations.
yeah, I can imagine it's important.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this has been fascinating. We are past our time, but there's a question coming to you at the end because you've done so much traveling, and so you've heard a lot of different languages. What is your favorite foreign word?
It's actually obrigado, which is a
Oh.
Portuguese word for thank you. Again, working with so many different great folks around the world, it's right to give thanks. And so for me, that's a big one on the top of the list.
Oh, that's great. I love that. I love that word.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming here today. I really appreciate you sharing all this really valuable information.
Obrigado to you and all your colleagues listening to the podcast.
Obrigado. So if you like this podcast and learn something, please give us a 5-star rating. Steve, where can people reach you if they'd like to connect with you?
I'm available on LinkedIn at Steve Becker, all one word. So that's probably a good place. I haven't yet set up a website, so that's a good place to start.
Okay, so go to LinkedIn at Steve, Steve, Becker, B as in boy, Ecker. You can find him on LinkedIn and read more about him. So while you're online, give us a 5-star, forward this episode along to somebody else that you know in the diagnostic, medical device, or biotech industry. And if you have questions, you can certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn. It's Wendy Pease. Easy to find, or just put Wendy Pease translation. So thanks so much, and please tune in to the next episode.
That's a wrap for this session. A big thanks to you for listening to the Global Marketing Show. Hope you had just as much fun as I did. New sessions launch weekly on all places you find podcasts: Apple, Spotify, Google Play, and of course on our website. If you know someone interested in this topic, please tell them about us. Au revoir for now.